Hello everyone. Now, assuming you watched my last two videos, and if you haven't, go watch those now. But this will be my final video in this series. Although I have been brainstorming future videos, where I could discuss more parallels between some of the Greek philosophers and what they said and what the Bible says. But for now, in this particular series, this will be the final video. I just wanted to clarify that. And now for the final main philosopher that we'll be discussing is Socrates. And after that, I will end with a discussion of the questions posed in the first video of this series, one by one. But with all that being said, let's get right into this. Now, to begin, let's first discuss a little background on Socrates. Socrates was rather a humble man. He did not really consider himself wise, even though he was thought to be wise. He also never wrote anything. Everything that we know about him and what he taught comes from sources like Plato, among others, who was one of Socrates' students, by the way. Now, Socrates' main focus, or main philosophical focus, was on morals and ethics and such things that you might call spiritual, for lack of a better term that can come to mind, because he talked a lot about the divine. He also spent a lot of time approaching and interrogating those deemed as wise to see if they were really wise, and often found those with a reputation for wisdom or who claimed to be wise were not really so. Now, here's one good example that comes from the dialogue called the Apology of Socrates, or just simply Apology. And this is what Socrates says. Accordingly, I went to one who had the reputation for wisdom and observed him. His name I need not mention. He was a politician whom I selected for examination. And the result was as follows. When I began to talk with him, I could not help thinking he was not really wise. Although he was thought wise by many, and still wiser by himself, and thereupon I tried to explain to him that he thought himself wise, but was not really wise. And the consequence was that he hated me, and his enmity was shared by several who were present and heard me. So I left him, saying to myself as I went away, well, although I do not suppose that either of us knows anything really beautiful and good, I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing, and thinks that he knows. I neither know, nor think that I know. Now, at the end of this reference, Socrates talks about how he was better off than the politician he questioned, obviously. Because while Socrates laid no claim to knowledge, this politician claimed to know things he did not really know. Sounds a whole lot like today's politicians, doesn't it? And so Socrates concluded he was better off than he. Now, this same sentiment was echoed by Paul in 1 Corinthians 8, chapter 8, verse 2, which says, "Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know." And again in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, it says, "Do not deceive yourselves. If any of you thinks he is wise by the standards of this age, he should become a fool in order to be wise." Now, this last verse, to an extent, corresponds to Socrates, because while Socrates considered himself a fool, many of his opponents certainly consider him a fool. Using the Bible's logic, Socrates was the one who was wise. Now, Socrates went on to question many other people who were considered wise in this manner, and in doing so, he drew a lot of anger and opposition to himself. And eventually, this culminated in him being put on trial, where he was accused of impiety towards the gods of Athens, and for corrupting the youth by his teachings. Now, this latter charge was because many of the youth who were inspired by Socrates' teachings, or who simply listened to him, went around and started doing what he was doing, questioning and examining those deemed wise in the society at the time, like the politicians, the poets, and the rhetoricians. It was basically like if you were a teacher or a professor today, for example, in our modern society, and a bunch of students and random people came up to you and kept hounding and debating and testing what you claimed to be knowledgeable about. But the fact is, most of those deemed wise in Athens that were upset by all of this were mostly mad because their claim to wisdom was being proven false. And by being proven false, they probably lost money, power, and influence. Now, here are those who were Socrates' accusers at his trial, according to him, as it says in the Apology. That is to say, the specific people and groups that were against him. And this is what the Apology says. "And this is the reason why my three accusers, Miletus, Ananias, and Lycon, have set upon me. Miletus, who has a quarrel with me on behalf of the poets, Anytus on behalf of the craftsmen and politicians, and Lycon on behalf of the rhetoricians. And as I said at the beginning, I cannot expect to get rid of such a massive calamity and all in a moment. Now, all these groups were opposing him for the reasons I stated earlier, but let's also not forget about the accusation of impiety towards the gods. This accusation is one that the craftsmen would have focused on, and it was probably a very similar situation as it was in the book of Acts, chapter 19, verse 23 through 27, which says, "About that time there arose a disturbance about the way. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in no little business for the craftsmen. He called them all together, along with the workmen in related trades, and said, 'Men, you know we receive a good income from this business, and you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray numbers of people here in Ephesus, and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that man-made gods are no gods at all. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia, and the world will be robbed of her divine majesty.'" And so I kind of see, like with Paul here, Socrates was being opposed by the craftsmen, I want to bet, probably for very similar reasons. He was a threat to their income. Now, why exactly was Socrates being accused of impiety towards the gods? There are a couple reasons. One reason was like with Plato and Aristotle, who were against the immoral stories the poets created about the gods. Socrates also opposed them and believed the divine would not behave in such immoral ways that they were portrayed as and behaving as in the stories. And another reason was that while being accused of opposing the gods of Athens, he was also accused of introducing new ones, and this is a reference to what has been called his daimonion, if that's how you pronounce it. Now here is how Socrates describes his daimonion. "You have heard me at sundry times and diverse places of an oracle or sign which comes to me, and is the divinity which Miletus ridicules in the indictment. This sign, which is a kind of voice, first began to come to me when I was a child. It always forbids me, but never commands me to do anything which I am going to do." Now, first off, the word daimonion and daimon is actually where we derive the modern word demon from. However, the difference is the word demon always refers to an evil spirit or a demon. However, the original Greek word, which is where it derives from, daimon or daimonion, again, if that's how you pronounce it, which demon derives, has a slightly different meaning. The word daimon simply refers to divine being or spirit, which is not necessarily evil. And daimonion refers to a guiding spirit, which again is not necessarily something evil. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I believe that this daimon or inner voice guiding Socrates was actually an angel. And the way Socrates describes this guiding spirit sounds like an angel, for this is what the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, verse 14 says about angels. "Are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation?" Now, obviously, because of a lack of a better term and the ignorance of Socrates, he doesn't actually call it an angel. And at the end of the video, I will go into more detail why I am convicted that what he's describing is in fact an angel, which the Bible describes as ministering spirits. And in Socrates' case, this spirit was, according to him, guiding and ministering to him, essentially. But now all this was also to show you why Socrates was also accused of making up new gods. So now that I have established some critical background on Socrates, let's get into many of his beliefs and teachings concerning God. And most of these come from the dialogues called Apology, which we've already been going into, and one called Crito, where Socrates, and in Crito, Socrates was put on trial and had to make a defense for himself and explain himself. And Crito takes place right after the Apology dialogue, where Socrates is put in prison and awaiting the day of his execution as he was sentenced to death. Now, during Socrates' trial, with all those that were opposing him, as I have already discussed earlier, here's what he says about God and wisdom. This inquisition has led to me having many enemies of the worst and most dangerous kind, and has given occasion also to many calumnies, if I'm pronouncing that word. And I am called wise, for my hearers always imagine that I myself possess the wisdom which I find wanting in others. But the truth is, O men of Athens, that God only is wise. And by his answer, he intends to show that the wisdom of men is worth little or nothing. He is not speaking of Socrates. He is only using my name by way of illustration, as if he said, he, O men, is the wisest, who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is in truth worth nothing. Now, Socrates' statement about only God being wise and man's wisdom being useless is seen also in the Bible. Here's what 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 20 through 21 says. Where is the wise man? Where is the scholar? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its own wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. And again, a few verses down at verse 25, it says, For the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength. Now, later in Socrates' trial, hear what Socrates says when he is threatened with the death penalty. But I do know that injustice and disobedience to a better, whether God or man, is evil and dishonorable, and I will never fear or avoid a possible good rather than a certain evil. And therefore, if you let me go now and are convinced by Anytus, who said that since I had been prosecuted, I must be put to death, or if not, that I ought never to have been prosecuted at all, and that if I escape now, your sons will all be utterly ruined by listening to my words. If you say to me, Socrates, this time we will not mind Anytus, and you shall be let off, but upon one condition, that you are not to inquire and speculate in this way any more, and that if you are caught doing so again, you shall die. If this was the condition on which you let me go, I should reply, Men of Athens, I honor and love you, but I shall obey God rather than you. And while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet, and saying to him after my manner, You, my friend, a citizen of the great and mighty, wise city of Athens, are you not ashamed of heaping up the greatest amount of money and honor and reputation, and caring so little about wisdom and truth and the greatest improvement of the soul, which you never regard or heed at all? Now, when Socrates said the words, I shall obey God rather than you, it's very identical to when Peter and the apostles in the Bible, when they were being persecuted by the Jews and the Jewish Sanhedrin, which was basically the high court of the Jews at that time, started persecuting the apostles for preaching the gospel and healing people miraculously. And so this is what the book of Acts chapter 5 verse 28 through 29 says. We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name, he said. Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood. Peter and the other apostles replied, We must obey God rather than men. And so in the same way, the Jewish Sanhedrin were trying to forbid Peter and the apostles from preaching the gospel. So the Athenian court in which Socrates was put on trial threatened to kill him if he kept teaching what he was teaching. And in the end, of course, they did. Now, on the next page, and we're still in the dialogue of called the Apology, Socrates refers to himself as a gift and a gadfly from God to refute, rebuke, and exhort, among other things, the people of Athens. Here is what he says. And now, Athenians, I am not going to argue for my own sake, as you may think, but for yours, that you may not sin against the God by condemning me, who I am his gift to you. For if you kill me, you will not easily find a successor to me, who, if I may use such a ludicrous figure of speech, am a sort of gadfly given to the state by God. And the state is a great and noble steed who is tardy in his motions, owing to his very size, and requires to be stirred into life. I am that gadfly which God has attached to the state, and all day long and in all places am always fastened upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you. You will not easily find another like me, and therefore I would advise you to spare me. I dare say that you may feel out of temper like a person who is suddenly awakened from sleep, and you may think that you might easily strike me dead as Anytus advises, and then you would sleep for the remainder of your lives, unless God in his care of you sent you another gadfly. When I say that I am given to you by God, the proof of my mission is this: if I had been like other men, I should not have neglected my own concerns, or patiently seen the neglect of them during all these years, and have been doing yours, coming to you individually like a father or elder brother, exhorting you to regard virtue. Such conduct, I say, would be unlike human nature. Now, whether or not what Socrates is saying here is true, and that is him referring to himself as a gadfly from God, figuratively speaking, he sounds a lot like a prophet, and is essentially saying that God sent him on a mission to do and say the things he said and did. And this goes back to one of the questions I posed at the beginning of the series about how I believe God was using some of these philosophers from Athens to prepare for the coming of Paul and the gospel in Athens a few hundred years later. In a similar way to how John the Baptist prepared the way for the first coming of Jesus. Now, besides all this, Socrates said and taught other things concerning God, but I will leave more information for perhaps a future video. However, something I failed to mention earlier was that another factor that motivated Socrates into the life of philosophy was that there was a famous oracle in Greece called the Oracle of Delphi, that one of Socrates' followers and friends, when asked the question who the wisest person in Greece was, to which the oracle said it was Socrates. Now, Socrates, upon hearing this, disbelieved it, since, as I said earlier, he never considered himself wise. However, he did take what the oracle said as a challenge, and that was another reason he went around questioning people wiser than himself to prove the oracle wrong. Okay, now, before getting to the conclusion of this video, I do have a few honorable mentions of some other Greek philosophers, and also a Greek poet, that spoke about God, and I feel is worth mentioning. To start off with, we have the ancient Greek poet named Pindar. And here are some of the things he said concerning God. It is God that accomplishes all terms to hopes, God who overtakes the flying eagle, outpasses the dolphin in the sea, who bends under his strength the man with thoughts too high. Now, this quote from Pindar really shows that he considered God to be all-powerful, and furthermore, what he says concerning the high-minded man is in agreement with the Bible, as it says in Matthew chapter 23, verse 12. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Now, I also must mention that Pindar does talk about other Greek gods and goddesses, and seems to have some belief in them. But this particular quote, and there's another one that I didn't mention, shows that he distinguishes between the gods and the goddesses and the one supreme God. Another honorable mention is a philosopher named Antisthenes, who was another student of Socrates. However, many of his works did not survive, and only fragments exist. And I also don't have any quotes from him to share. However, it is known that he wrote a book called On Natural Philosophy. And in this book, he distinguishes between many gods and goddesses that the masses believed in, and the single supreme God, which Antisthenes claimed was all natural and inherent in nature itself. He argued that this one supreme God could not be seen with our eyes, and that God did not resemble anything that could be seen in the physical world. No imagery or representation like statues, for example, could truly depict him. As you can see, this is very much in line with God's character in the Bible, and it is commanded numerous times throughout the Bible that we should not draw our hearts to idols or images of any kinds, nor make any of them. Now, you're probably asking, if many of the books of Antisthenes wrote are lost, then how do I know what this book is about? Well, like I said earlier, there are fragments of it still out there, and so it can be deduced what it was about. And as always, sources will be linked in the description, so you can have more information. Now, one final honorable mention is the philosopher named Pythagoras, who is recorded as saying, "We come from God as the tree from the root, and the stream from the spring, and that's why we should always be in contact with him, as the trunk from the root, because the stream dries up when it is separated from the spring, and the tree dies when it is uprooted." These words from Pythagoras are in agreement and are very identical to what Jesus says in John chapter 15, verses 4 through 5. "Remain in me, and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If a man remains in me, and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." Now, besides these three men who I have mentioned, there are a few others as well who spoke of God, but to avoid dragging this video out too long, I will list them in the description of this video. Now, I want to go back to the subject of Socrates' so-called daimonion. As I said before, I am convinced that this daimonion was actually an angel who helped give counsel to Socrates. The evidence also is in favor of it being an angel, because if you look at the things Socrates said concerning God, and the fact that he opposed the tales portraying the divine as evil, lustful brutes, essentially, as false, believing that which is truly divine as above such ways, all this is completely against Satan's agenda. Socrates was to an extent uprooting the corrupt beliefs concerning how many people saw the divine. If Socrates was truly being led by a demon, his words and actions, quite frankly, just would not make any sense. And you will also find that I am not the only one of the opinion that Socrates' daimonion was really an angel. Many of the early church fathers also believed Socrates was also being led by an angel. One of them, for example, was Clement of Alexandria. Now, lastly, let's go back to the questions posed at the very beginning of this series. And the first of which is, did some of the ancient Greek philosophers teach about God? Well, I think at this point the answer is pretty obvious to anyone at this point. So let's go to question 2. Where did the unknown God the Athenians were worshiping in the Bible come from? Well, I can't give a certain answer, but I think it's a very real possibility that the combination of the teachings from many of these philosophers about the one true God culminated in the worship of the unknown God. And as I said before, I believe that many of these philosophers inspired it. And lastly, for question 3, did God use some of the ancient Athenian philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to prepare the way for the gospel, through which Paul would come a few hundred years later? Well, I would certainly argue that he did. I would argue that God used them in the same way he used John the Baptist to prepare the way for Jesus. Then again, my word is not authoritative, and I do not claim to know God's thoughts in this regard. Yet when we consider the teachings and the views of these philosophers towards God and the things of God, when we consider the story of Paul and Athens in the Bible, the unknown God the Athenians worshipped, and Paul proclaiming the whole truth to them, telling them that what they were worshiping as the unknown God was the very God who he would preach to them, the pieces align almost perfectly, and I myself believe that God did indeed use these philosophers, and they probably didn't even realize it. And with that, well, I think Socrates, you might argue Socrates to some extent might have, because he talked about how God was using him. So I don't know. But anyway, with that, this concludes this video and this series about the Greek philosophers and their teachings and beliefs concerning God. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all in the next video.